Hi, I'm Dave Snodgrass, and today on Table Ready Gaming we're going to try something a little bit different. Like I said on a previous video, the hobby space is currently unavailable since we are having a little bit of home renovations going on, but we'll get back to that here soon. And I thought I would join the community of talking heads to talk about D&D. I've been playing Dungeons & Dragons and role-playing games for quite a few years now, and when I started my Instagram account showing off the painted miniatures, I started getting asked questions about how to run a game and stuff like that. So today I thought I would just take a quick moment, make a short video of some tips that I wish I had known as I started my game mastering career, and hopefully you'll find some of these useful. So 7 great tips for a new DM. Here we go. Okay, so tip number 1, and this one I've heard other online personalities give, but simply you don't need to know all the rules. When you first look at the player's handbook, the DMG and monster manuals and stuff like that, it could be a little overbearing, and I think there's a common misconception online that the dungeon master or game master has to know all the rules for the game that they're going to play. Really, I just think this slows down the time at which it takes to get to the table. While I think the game master should be familiar with the core rules of the game, they should not be responsible for learning how to play every individual character, how every magic item works, and everything like that. There's just simply too many rules for one person to remember. Frankly, also, one thing that I have noticed in my own gaming is that sometimes it's better just to make a call on the fly rather than trying to break the game, break the momentum, and look that up. And if you don't know a rule, I wouldn't be too worried about trying to hide it from your players. In fact, generally just make a call, say this is how we're going to do it for tonight, but after the game session, I'm going to go back and look that up. If it is a core mechanic or if it's one of your first games, maybe you pause a little bit more to look up rules so everybody learns. But I honestly believe learning all the rules at the table is something that every player and the game master should invest in, and it's not something that you have to know them all by heart, locked in your brain forever until you can start a game. I mean, I personally still get rules wrong. My latest game sessions, I realized for 3 sessions I was running critical hits from 4th edition and not 5th edition. So, I mean, don't be embarrassed by it. Everybody makes mistakes, and don't let it hold up for you for starting your game. Just get on the table, get playing, and honestly, I think most game masters are, kind of tinkerers by nature anyways, so you'll probably homebrew stuff and just find things that you work better for you. I mean, I know I personally, my game would probably infuriate the online community because the way we do combat is completely different than how the rules kind of suggest it should be played, but I think it gives smoother, faster combat and helps the game move better in my sessions. So that's tip number 1. All right, so tip number 2. This one I see almost like weekly on Reddit, Facebook, and other online communities when talking about role-playing games, and that's how do you say no to a player. Basically, the idea usually is like, when I see this come up the most, the scenario that's being presented is that the player wants to do something just crazy. Like, let's say they want to drop the moon on some goblins. I mean, just something that's so ridiculous that there's no way they should be able to succeed like this, but they just think if they roll that critical 20, they're going to be able to do whatever they want. And that's clearly not necessarily the case. But then again, players don't like being told, no, you can't do something. It's like you're stifling my creativity, blah, 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 and so forth, or you're railroading me. I mean, I see this complaint all over. So as a GM, one advice that I think to deal with this situation and just situations in general is don't say no, say yes, but. And this is a kind of improv rule. If you've ever done improv, the general idea is that you don't say no, you say yes, and that kind of keeps the story moving forward. So for my example of, let's say the mage wants to drop the moon on this squad of goblins. And he says, can I do this? And first-time GM might be like, no, that's ridiculous. But if you take that yes, but approach, what you could say is, yeah, I'm going to need an intelligence check or an arcana check to see if you know the spell lore that would be required to drop this, to even maybe start harnessing the power that you would need to pull the moon down onto the goblins. So they roll that, and let's say they get their natural 20. Okay, great. So you have now been able to find the Arcana spell, or you know the type of magic that you're going to need to make this event happen. But I need you to now, this is a very powerful spell. You're doing something really cosmetically going to be changing the world here by dropping the moon on some goblins. So why don't you roll a wisdom check for me and see if, or an intelligence check, and that will tell you like what kind of ramifications might happen or something like that for dropping this moon on the goblins. And by doing these kinds of things, adding different checks, still thematically going around with it, but giving the player kind of like some opportunity to say, oh, maybe this isn't a great idea, but it's their idea, not yours. Can kind of do two things for you. One, maybe discourage the player from doing this action, or two, giving the player more options to fail at this action. And because the player saw the chance to move forward with these things, generally I find that they find this type of failure easier to digest than a simple like, no, you can't do that, you can't roll, or you can certainly try, oh look, you rolled an 18 or 19, it didn't happen, or I rolled a 20, it didn't happen. So that's just some things to kind of think in mind. Again, this is a really kind of absurd example that I brought up, but generally try to encourage yes, but try not to have the players fail when they roll the 1. Maybe they don't succeed as well, or maybe they succeed in a way that then triggers some sort of event that isn't a success for them. Maybe this works really well for like low DC checks. So for example, like a thief going to unlock like a door at an inn or something like that, and they roll that 1 or that 2, instead of not being able to unlock this door, which should be a really simple thing for their character thematically to do, maybe they unlock the door, but in doing so, they make a loud noise and they hear movement over in the room that they're trying to break into, or maybe they trigger something else. So yes, but great rule to try to start applying. If you want more on this kind of idea, I'd encourage you to look at improv and improv comedy. There's a lot more talking about the yes, but rule of improv. So on to our next tip. Okay, so for our next tip, tip 3, I'm going to put this one as the create characters, not plot. I think one thing that's a little bit different when you're running your first game, opposed to, say, writing a story or a screenplay or something like that, is that we don't have, as game masters, we don't have complete control of what our players are going to do and the actions they're going to take. And if you try to sit there and come up with every possible outcome that your players may think of, I think you're going to be constantly surprised of what a group of 4 to 5 people can come up with, opposed to your one, brain working on this problem. So generally when I'm starting to run a campaign or I'm setting up a new game, I don't spend a lot of time on plot, so to speak, or like this event's going to happen, and then this event's going to happen, and then this event's going to happen. Instead, I focus more heavily on characters and the resources that those characters have and the motivations that characters have. There's a great writing mechanic called the Snowflake theory, or Snowflake method of writing. And basically you start small and you just kind of like branch out, branch out, branch out. So most campaigns, I think, need to be hung on a villain, right? And instead of saying like, hey, first the villain's going to build an evil lair, then they're going to adopt a bunch of peasants, and then they're going to sacrifice them all into a giant ritual that will then summon some demon or something like that to end the world. Instead, you have a villain, and you think to yourself, okay, well, what does this villain want to accomplish? Well, they want to summon a demon into the end to, destroy the world or whatever. Okay, well, what do they need to do this? Well, they need a bunch of peasants to sacrifice. They need a cool sacrificing knife, and they need some sweet robes to, look good while they're doing it, obviously. Okay, so then what resources does the villain have to start out with? Well, maybe they're an evil mage or something like that, so they already got the sweet-ass lair set up, but their robes are, for casting spells, not sacrificing people. Herding a bunch of peasants into their scary, dark tower is not going to be easy, so they're going to have to get some people on board to go get those peasants. And then finally, maybe they have to research the method to how they're going to do this summoning this demon. So now once I have my character, I have his motivations, and I have kind of like general like list of resources and things he needs to accomplish or she needs to accomplish, you can go ahead and start kind of planning your game sessions around that, knowing that the game master, the villain is moving even off camera. So just because the players haven't encountered the villain yet doesn't mean that he's not starting or she's not starting to get this ball rolling. And I think personally, if you work with like characters and their motivations and their resources, and you approach your game world like that, you're gonna get a lot further than like, okay, in chapter 1, the villain's gonna build their lair. In chapter 2, they're gonna get the sweet robes. In chapter 3, they're gonna get all the peasants and stuff like that. And then chapter 4 is the final climax to, summon the demon and whatever, because you might find that your players just go off in some different direction, or they come up with some sort of plan that maybe you thought you're gonna have this lawful good party, and now all of a sudden you have an evil party, and they've killed all the peasants. So now the villain's plans have been thwarted because there's no peasants left. So again, don't waste a bunch of time coming up with plot. Again, try to get characters, resources, and motivations. And then if you want to create conflict, which is I think the number one role as a storyteller and a game master, is that you're trying to create drama by creating conflict. And you do that by having opposing characters with different motivations that obviously are going to clash with each other. And then you give each of those NPCs resources at their exposal to do these things, so that you get a little bit more of that clash that's a little bit more organically. And you don't really have to figure out like how necessarily like A, B, C, D world domination they're going to do this. Instead, just kind of let these, as the players enter the world and they start interacting with your world, let these NPCs be reactive, and it just helps. I think just generally, it's a very much easier way to develop a plot line than trying to have a rigid timeline or outline that never is going to survive first contact with your players. Okay, so for our fourth tip on this, and that is defeated doesn't mean dead. And one of the things that I think I ran into, at least specifically when I was a game master starting out, is I really wanted to encourage my players to do more role-playing and more social interactions. I kind of got tired very quickly of the dungeon meat grinder where you go through and you clear a room, clear a room, clear a room. I'm not, again, saying that that's like the wrong way to play Dungeons and Dragons or RPG games. I mean, combat is obviously part of the game. I think over like a third of the rulebook is dedicated to combat alone. I'm just talking about how I would prefer play the game, and just some things that I personally were running into. So please don't take this as me. If you enjoy the dungeon crawl, I'm not saying you're having fun wrong. You have to play the game how I want to play it. Just if you're looking to get more social encounters and stuff like that, then I think defeated doesn't mean dead is a good approach to do this. And what I mean by that is award XP to the players for outthinking villains, for outmaneuvering villains, and for basically getting past a villain in a social encounter. So like a really good example of this might be like a noble, for example, at a party. And say the party has a goal to bring this noble or to defeat this noble to overcome their goals. Like we said in our previous tip, the motivations of this noble is against the party's interest, and he's trying to bring his resources to bear, or her resources to bear, to thwart the party's own motivation. So let's say they're able to, in the classic D&D sense, dungeon crawly sense, you would kill that noble, he would award you so much experience points for being killed. But let's say at a party they're able to embarrass him so much that he loses so much social capital or she loses so much social capital that they're no longer able to bring their resources to bear because they don't have the votes in the Senate or the Republic, or they've lost favor with the king, or people just no longer trust them anymore. Then in a sense, that party has defeated this villain through a social encounter, and then should be rewarded the experience points for this defeated villain. So that's a great way to kind of make social interactions and motivate players to do that. I mean, in my current game, I think we're up to player 4, and we're up to level 4, and the player with the most body count is at like 5 kills right now, because I do tend to run a more social game than I roll in like a dungeon crawly combat style game. Again, that's just my personal preference. Other examples of this could be like, say they have to get past a griffin in the woods, and they are able to bait the griffin off to someplace else rather than necessarily going out and fighting it. That would be another, in my opinion, example of defeating an enemy without killing it. Or perhaps they're able to, sneak past a goblin patrol. Well, then they've defeated those goblins without killing them, and I would still award experience. Now, in my games, I personally still award full experience for simply getting past the villain, whether it's a social encounter, sneaking by, outmaneuvering that villain, or killing the villain. Another kind of nice thing about as a game master is if you implement this in your own game, what you're going to find out is you don't have to come up with as many villains, because a villain that is defeated and not dead can come back for revenge. And that really kind of helps you create these nemesises that characters are kind of, can see reoccurring, and they can get a little bit of emotionally attached to a villain. Another thing too, to be careful about this, kind of a pitfall, and I think you see this in a lot of like sitcoms on television, is if your villain is so easily defeated and defeated so many times, then I think to the players they no longer are threatening, and they almost kind of become this like comedic nuisance. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is eventually after, like, in my opinion, the 4th or 5th time this villain has been defeated, then it's time for the villain to be ultimately defeated. And you can segue into a new villain. Maybe this villain was a sergeant, and now they get to see the higher end guy that's really pulling the strings. Or because this person has been removed, and these people have now in your party has now moved up in the social class, or moved up in level, or moved up in whatever, someone else now opposes their goals. So those are my thoughts, again, on the defeated doesn't mean dead style of play. All right, so for my 5th rule, I should have probably moved this up a little bit higher, because again, I see a lot of people online complaining about this, and personally I think, like a lot of tools in a game master's toolbox, there's a time and a place for everything, and a lot of like certain tools kind of get a bad rep online because players see it too much, or maybe newer GMs just aren't as experienced with it, and so they don't implement it as well. And that tool I'm talking about specifically right now is railroading. All the time I see players being like, oh, my GM's railroading me, or making my character do this, or making the story go this direction that I don't think we should be going, or I feel hemmed in and everything like that. Again, as a game master, personally, I don't have any problems with railroading, especially when it's like, hey, all aboard, next stop is Awesome Town. And some of my railroading techniques that I have used have been very open about it. I mean, I've literally have put players on trains, boats, other modes of transportation. I think that a railroaded prologue is a great way to get the game started. One of my favorite role-playing games of all time has always been like the Skyrim, Morrowind, Oblivion genre. And I think those games start out really well by saying like, hey, here's a prison escape, or here's this event that you're going through. And then now that once we've gotten you to that prologue, I've introduced you to the world, I've set up the world, I've introduced you to some of the key players, now go, and then enter the sandbox area. Another thing that I really like about prologued events, especially at the beginning of a game, is it gives you a reason to make this party have to work together. I generally will try to have an event or a place where all these players are meeting. You tell me why you're getting a passage on this boat. Everybody, maybe you're a sailor, maybe you're a passenger, emissary, whatever. But then you're on the boat, event happens, and it's like, okay, well, why do we trust each other? Why is our party working together? It's because you are literally on the same boat together, And so you have to work together, and while you may not maybe openly trust that person yet, you trust that person more than the evil merfolk thing that's climbing out of the ocean trying to eat your face. So again, and then if you have this prologue go on for like 2 to 3 sessions, generally I consider the prologue levels 1 to level 3. That helps the players build relationships in character. Helps you give a chance to kind of give like examples of how rules are used and how the game's played. Also, too, it can protect your players, especially at those lower levels when they're extremely squishy. I kind of personally subscribe in sandbox mode of monsters are on the table and a bear lives in that cave. And if you go to that cave, you're going to fight a bear. Or if you go to that mountain, you're going to fight a hill giant. And frankly, I don't know if your party can fight that giant or not, or anything like that. That's just what's living there. So again, that style play can be very dangerous at low levels. Another thing that I kind of think about a good time to railroad is during key events that are happening. I generally think of my games kind of the sessions of like a play, where you have a prologue, you have Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, and then an epilogue. Usually the end of Act 2 or midway through Act 3 are kind of ways that I will start to railroad, because at that time the villain has started to create enough resources that stuff's happening now. And I mean, I'll give the player usually an option to get off the train if they want to, but with the knowledge that the villain is probably going to accomplish their end goal here. And I also think another thing that makes railroading a little bit more tolerable is one giving the option for the players to get off at certain points if they don't want to. And one of the key things too is I'm not a big fan of villains that have world-ending strategies. I mean, if you see the Avengers, for example, the world's always about to end, because that's someplace for another video. But don't be afraid to railroad. It's a great tool when used correctly. I'm trying to keep this video somewhat short and not get too rambly. So if you want to hear more about my opinions on good villain motivations and good evil plots for villains, just list it down in the comments. Again, I'm just going to take a quick moment too that if you're enjoying this kind of video, please let me know by hitting that like button or subscribing. And maybe we'll have more of these kinds of videos in the future. All right, on to our next tip. Okay, tip number six is, I might have just summoned the devil there. Anyhow, tip number 6 is host a session 0. Personally, I'm embarrassed that I have been playing, not really embarrassed, but surprised at how long I've been playing a game before the idea of a session 0 was ever shown to me. And when it hit me, it was like, oh my goodness, why don't you just do this for every game? Sorry, cat just jumped off the chair, broke my train of thought. Okay, so we're talking about session 0. During session 0, there's a few things that you want to try to accomplish. First things that I'd like to do in a session 0 is let the players all build characters together. That helps you get a more balanced party and kind of lets players let you know sort of what they're thinking, what kind of like character archetype they want to go with, and stuff like that. Second thing I like doing with a session 0 is letting people kind of like, as the GM, pitch your game to the players. Ask them what kind of games they want to play and tell them what kind of game you like to run. Maybe give them a little bit of backstory, bullet list about the world and kind of the things that they're going to be going and doing. So if you're like, hey, this is going to be a really combat-heavy campaign, maybe you don't spend as much time with your bard. Or, hey, this is going to be a really social campaign, in high society, maybe a barbarian may not be the best class for this. I mean, this is very general stuff like that, examples that I'm giving. Another thing that I would talk about in a session 0 is what kind of themes does the players like, and what kind of themes do you want to run? I mean, so I always scale my fantasy like this. Like, on a 1 we have Lord of the Rings, and on a 10, we kind of have a more Game of Thrones. I would say my fantasy world is probably an 8-ish. My personal favorite fantasy novels are novels by Joe Abercrombie. I liked the first 3 books of Game of Thrones. I tend to like a darker, grittier fantasy. I cut my teeth on fantasy with Warhammer before actually Dungeons and Dragons. So mine is a world where people murder each other in the mud for their boots. So, I like to have that conversation with players and let them know that this is the world we're getting into. Another thing too is I always like to ask, is there any themes or anything that as a player you don't really want to see? This can be anything from just, extreme gore, slavery, drug use, for example, like things that maybe make your players uncomfortable. Again, that's just a good thing to kind of let people know because, at the end of the day, we're playing a game with our friends, and the last thing you want to do is make someone feel, uncomfortable at the table. I have a very good friend that we play games with, and, he has had some family issues in the past with drugs. So personally, he does not want to play Breaking Bad, the role-playing game, because it's just affected him too much in his personal life, and that is totally fine. And I don't think there's anything wrong with a player admitting that, hey, I'm not comfortable with this. And if the game master knows those things, we can avoid it. Because at the end of the day, like I said, we're playing a game with friends. You want to tailor a good time. Make sure everyone at the table is getting what they want, yourself included. So that leads us right on to our last tip. Okay, and for our last tip is tip number 7. The game needs to be fun for you. So many players, I think I see this more in online communities than I personally never experienced this at my tables, but I read about it in Reddit forums and stuff like that. But somehow they think the game master is like there as a employee almost and is supposed to tailor the game to them, or game masters feel like they have to run this game that their players want. But like I said in tip number 6, at the end of the day, we're a group of friends playing a game together. It needs to be fun for everyone at the table. GM burnout's a real issue. Don't ever be ashamed or afraid to be like, hey guys, I know we're supposed to play D&D tonight, or we're supposed to play this RPG game tonight. I'm not prepped, or I just don't really know where to go. This is what board game collections are for, in my opinion. Or, pull out the N64 and fire up Mario Party again, or Mario Kart. Don't be afraid to tell players that you need to rotate out to another game master. We need to rotate another game master in. Or, we're halfway through the Tomb of Annihilations, and for me, I was like, this is a terrible module. I hate running it. It's a giant dungeon crawl. That's why I will probably never run the Dungeon of the Mad Mage. It's an epic dungeon. That's not what I want to run as a game master. And if players came to me and said, hey, we really want to play this game, I'm like, that's great. Why don't you run the game, or why don't we find you a GM that would actually have fun doing this? Because frankly, I'm going to get through probably room 3, and then I'm going to be like, and the Mad Mage decide to have a social party. We're all going to get together and have court intrigue. And this is going to be Downton Abbey and the Mad Mage, because that is more the style of game that I like to run and that I like to play with that social intrigue. I'm the weirdo that thought, the idea of a trade federation in Star Wars was awesome, and I wanted to hear more about the corporate banking guilds and stuff like that. My old rogues in the past, whenever they would get a bunch of money, they started investing in the community, setting up fronts, and basically building their criminal, illicit empire, because that's what I wanted my players to do. So that's the kind of game I want. At the end of the day, it's a game. It needs to be fun for everyone at the table. And also, too, if you are a player in a game, don't be afraid to be like, hey, guys, I still want to be friends. We're great friends, but you know what? This Dungeons & Dragons or this role-playing game is just not for me. I have several friends that are great people. I'd love to go bowling with them. I'd love to go see a movie with them. I'd love to sit down and play a board game with them, but the style of RPG that they like to run, I don't want to sit there for 4 hours running that kind of game. And so politely, I just decline. So those are my 7 tips for new DMs, or maybe even a little slightly more experienced DMs. Again, if you found this video useful, please let me know. Hopefully we'll be back in the hobby studio here in a couple of days. We might have one more video in this style while we make that transition. Again, I'm Dave Snodgrass. This is Table Ready Gaming. You can click down here to subscribe. You can click up here for a video that recently came from my YouTube, or a video YouTube thinks you might like. And then down here is something else that I kind of just thought was interesting and cool. Again, thanks so much for watching.